Virginia, 1856. In a land that spoke endlessly about freedom, not everyone was meant to taste it. Beyond the grand homes and quiet countryside, there existed another America, one built on silence, labor, and lives that were never meant to belong to themselves. Morning fog rested low over the plantation fields. The air smelled of damp soil and wood smoke. Workers moved before the sun fully rose, their footsteps steady, practiced, expected. Life here followed rules that no one dared question. Inside the main house, however, a different kind of tension was growing. The plantation owner was a man respected in society, wealthy, influential, and deeply concerned with reputation. In a world where status meant everything, appearances had to remain perfect. And yet, inside his own home, perfection was slipping away. His daughter did not fit the mold. She was educated, quiet, and observant. She read more than she spoke. She listened more than she agreed. And in a society where women were expected to obey, her independence unsettled people. Neighbors whispered about her. Some called her difficult. Others said she lacked softness. Over time, however, one word began to follow her wherever she went: unmarriageable. In the 1850s, that word carried weight. A woman's future was decided by marriage. Without it, she became a problem to solve, an embarrassment to manage. But what no one understood was that she saw things differently. When she looked out toward the fields, she didn't see property. She saw people. She noticed exhaustion in faces others ignored. She noticed silence where laughter should have been. And among those faces was one man everyone knew, though rarely by name. He was the strongest worker on the plantation, broad-shouldered, powerful, capable of work that broke other men. The overseers valued his strength. The owner valued his usefulness. But no one asked what it cost him. Years of labor had taught him to keep his head down, to speak only when spoken to survive by becoming invisible. Strength in his world was not pride, it was survival. Still, there are moments history never records. Moments when two people notice each other not by status, but by humanity. One afternoon, as rain tapped softly against the windows of the main house, their eyes met for the first time. Not as master and slave, not as owner and property, just two people, both trapped in lives chosen for them by others. It lasted only seconds, but sometimes seconds are enough to change everything. Inside the house, pressure was building. Her father worried constantly about what others thought. Invitations had slowed, conversations turned awkward. Questions about her future became unavoidable. Who would marry her? Who would take responsibility for a woman who refused to behave as expected? In that era, asking questions could be misunderstood as rebellion, and rebellion, in any form, was dangerous. So a decision began to form, not out of kindness, not out of understanding, but out of fear. Fear of shame, fear of gossip, fear of losing control. The plantation workers noticed changes before anyone explained them. Conversations stopped when certain people entered the room. Orders were given quietly. Plans were made behind closed doors. Something was coming. No one knew exactly what, only that the air felt different, heavy, uncertain. That night, the house stood unusually quiet. Rain had passed, but thunder still rolled somewhere far away. Lamps burned late into the evening as decisions were finalized. By morning, whispers spread across the plantation. The owner had made arrangements for his daughter's future. But what those arrangements meant, no one could have imagined. Because the choice he made would bind together two lives from completely different worlds, one rejected by society and one never accepted by it in the first place. And as the sun rose over the fields, neither of them knew that their lives were about to collide in a way that would challenge everything the plantation stood for. The system, the rules, the idea of ownership itself. The story was no longer about reputation. It was about power, and what happens when humanity begins to break through it. And by the time the truth became clear, it would already be too late to turn back. The morning had begun like any other, but before the day ended, a decision would be announced that no one on the plantation would ever forget. And that moment is where everything truly begins. By midday, the whispers had turned into certainty. Something had changed. The workers felt it first. Orders were shorter. Conversations between overseers stopped the moment anyone approached. Even the house servants moved carefully, as if afraid to say the wrong thing out loud. Inside the main house, the decision had already been made. Her father sat behind his desk, convinced he was solving a problem. In his mind, this was practicality, control, preservation of family honor. The world he understood left little room for emotion and even less room for defiance. His daughter stood quietly as he spoke, listening without interruption. She had learned long ago that arguing rarely changed anything. In that house, decisions flowed in one direction only. But this time was different, because this decision would not only decide her future, it would decide someone else's fate as well. Outside, the man everyone called the strongest on the plantation continued his work, unaware that his life had already been discussed, measured, and assigned a new purpose without his knowledge. Strength had always defined him in the eyes of others, not his thoughts, not his feelings, only what his body could endure. He had survived years by understanding one rule above all others: do not draw attention. Yet attention was now moving toward him. That afternoon, he was called away from the fields. The walk toward the main house felt longer than usual. Every step carried uncertainty. Being summoned rarely meant anything good. The house stood tall ahead of him, a symbol of authority he had spent his life avoiding whenever possible. Inside, the air felt colder. He stood near the doorway, hat in his hands, eyes lowered. He waited to be spoken to. Waiting is something he understood well. The owner explained the arrangement as if discussing property. Calm, logical, final. There would be no questions. The words settled heavily in the room. For a moment, silence followed, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. The man did not respond immediately, not because he agreed, but because agreement had never been required of him before. Across the room, she watched. For the first time, she saw clearly what power looked like when it stripped someone of choice entirely, and for the first time, she realized that whatever happened next would change both of their lives forever. Outside, life on the plantation continued as usual. Wagons moved, tools struck soil. The world did not stop for personal tragedy. But inside that house, something irreversible had begun. News spread quickly, though never openly. People spoke in low voices, unsure whether to believe it. Some saw it as punishment, others as cruelty. A few saw it as something even more dangerous, a challenge to the order everyone had accepted, because lines in that world were never meant to be crossed. That evening, the sun dipped low over the fields, painting everything in long shadows. The man returned to his quarters quieter than before. The future, once uncertain, now felt fixed in place. And yet, beneath the fear and confusion, something unfamiliar stirred. Not hope, but awareness. He had spent his entire life being told what he was worth. Now, suddenly, his existence had become central to a decision made by people who never truly saw him. Inside the house, she sat by the window long after dark. The weight of what her father had done settled heavily on her. She understood that this was meant to silence questions, to restore order. Instead, it had created something unpredictable. Because neither of them had chosen this path, and history has shown that when people are forced into roles they never asked for, the outcome rarely follows the plan of those in power. The plantation slept uneasily that night. Some sensed change coming but could not name it. Others ignored it, believing the system too strong to ever bend. But change does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it begins quietly, with two people realizing they are no longer willing to accept the roles written for them. And as the next morning approached, the first real consequences of that decision began to unfold. Because what started as an attempt to control the situation was slowly becoming something no one could control at all. And without realizing it, both of them were already stepping into a story that would test loyalty, courage, and the meaning of freedom itself. The next day would bring questions neither of them were prepared to answer. And once those questions were spoken aloud, nothing on the plantation would remain the same again. Morning arrived quietly, but nothing felt the same. The plantation woke as it always did, the sound of boots on dirt, tools being lifted, horses moving in their stalls. From a distance, everything looked unchanged. Order remained. Routine continued. But beneath that routine, tension had settled like a storm waiting to break. Word had spread, even without being spoken directly. People knew something unusual had happened inside the main house. They didn't know all the details, but they understood enough to feel uneasy. Because in a place built on strict boundaries, any change felt dangerous. He returned to the fields that morning with the same steady movements he had learned over years of survival. Work was familiar, predictable. It asked nothing except endurance, and endurance was something he understood. But now, every glance felt different. Some workers avoided his eyes. Others looked longer than usual, curiosity mixed with concern. No one said anything openly. Silence was safer. Silence always had been. Still, silence couldn't erase what had already been decided. Inside the house, she faced a different kind of isolation. The decision meant to secure her future had instead closed doors around her. Conversations with her father became brief, formal. He believed the matter settled, problem solved, but she knew better. She understood that what had been done was not kindness, it was control. A way to force her life back into a shape society could accept. Yet for the first time, she felt the weight of someone else's loss more than her own. She had lived with expectations her entire life, but he had lived without choice entirely. That realization stayed with her. Days passed, and the arrangement began to take form in quiet, uncomfortable ways. They crossed paths occasionally, in hallways, in the yard, near the edge of the fields. Each encounter brief, careful, watched. Neither of them knew how to exist in this new reality. For him, the danger was clear. Any misunderstanding, any perceived disrespect could bring punishment. Survival meant distance. For her, distance felt impossible. The more she observed, the more she recognized the injustice of what had been done in her name. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the heat finally began to fade, she walked beyond the house toward the edge of the property. It was a place few from the family visited, where the land stopped looking orderly and began to feel wild again. He was there, repairing a broken fence. For a moment, neither spoke. The air carried the sound of insects and distant voices from the quarters. It was the first time they stood without walls between them, without others watching closely. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful, not commanding, not apologizing, simply human. He answered cautiously, measuring every word. Years of experience had taught him that honesty could be dangerous, but something about the moment felt different. There was no order being given, no expectation of obedience, only two people trying to understand a situation neither had chosen. That conversation was short, simple, yet it changed something unseen. Because once people begin to speak as equals, even briefly, the illusion of hierarchy starts to weaken. Over the following weeks, small changes followed. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious enough to draw attention, but enough to shift the space between them. She listened more. He spoke a little easier. And slowly an understanding formed, not built on romance or rebellion, but on shared awareness. Both of them were trapped, just in different ways. Meanwhile, outside the plantation, the world itself was changing. Tensions across the country were rising. Arguments about slavery, freedom, and human rights were growing louder with each passing year. Newspapers carried stories of conflict, of resistance, of a nation slowly moving toward confrontation. But on the plantation, those larger changes felt distant. Here, power still ruled daily life. Her father watched carefully. He noticed the quiet shifts even if he didn't fully understand them. To him, order had to be maintained. Lines had to remain clear. The arrangement was meant to restore control, not blur it. and the more he sensed something changing, the more determined he became to reinforce the rules. What he didn't realize is that control often creates the very resistance it tries to prevent, because something new had begun to grow, not openly, not loudly, but steadily. Respect, and respect in a place built on ownership, was a dangerous thing. As summer deepened, the heat pressed heavily over the fields. Work grew harder, tempers shorter. The tension that once lived only inside the house now spread across the entire plantation. People felt it even if they couldn't explain why. The balance was shifting, and soon an event would force everyone to confront a truth they had avoided for years, that no system built on silence can remain silent forever. The moment was coming, and when it arrived, it would test not only their courage, but the limits of the world they lived in. The heat of late summer settled heavily over Virginia, pressing down on the fields and the people who worked them. Days grew longer, slower, and more exhausting. Even the air felt tense, as if something unseen was waiting to happen. On the surface, life continued as it always had. Work began at sunrise, orders were followed. The structure of the plantation remained intact. But beneath that structure, something had begun to shift. People noticed the small things first. The way conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. The way the overseer watched more closely than before. The way the owner's patience seemed thinner with each passing day. Control was tightening. Her father sensed that something was changing, even if he couldn't fully explain it. The arrangement he had made was supposed to restore order, to silence questions and secure her family's reputation. Instead, it had created uncertainty, and uncertainty made powerful men uncomfortable. He began enforcing distance. Schedules changed. Movements were monitored more carefully. Opportunities for interaction became limited. It was subtle, but deliberate, a reminder that lines still existed. For him, the message was clear: stay in your place, do your work, do not forget who holds power. He understood the warning. Survival had always depended on understanding unspoken rules. Yet something inside him had changed since that first conversation at the fence. For the first time, he had been spoken to without command. And once a person experiences dignity, even briefly, it becomes harder to return to silence. She felt it too. The walls of the house seemed smaller now. Conversations at dinner felt hollow. The life expected of her, quiet obedience, polite smiles, and acceptance, no longer felt possible. She had begun to see the plantation differently, not as home, but as a system built on imbalance. Every comfort she had known existed because someone else paid the price for it. That realization refused to leave her. One evening, raised voices echoed from the fields. A disagreement between an overseer and one of the younger workers escalated quickly. It wasn't unusual. Conflict was common where exhaustion and fear lived side by side. But this time, something changed. He stepped forward. Not in defiance, not with aggression, but simply to calm the situation. His presence alone was enough to stop things from turning violent. Strength, once used quietly, became protection rather than submission. The moment passed quickly. Work resumed. No punishment followed. Yet the overseer's expression lingered, and news of what happened reached the main house before nightfall. Her father saw it as a threat. Strength was acceptable when it served authority. It became dangerous when it inspired others. That night, decisions were discussed again behind closed doors. New rules, new limitations, a quiet effort to remind everyone of their place before order slipped any further. But pressure has consequences. The more control tightened, the more people felt its weight. Conversations in the quarters grew quieter but more intense. Questions began forming, questions that had long been buried under fear. Meanwhile, between the two of them, understanding continued in silence. They rarely spoke now, not because they wanted distance, but because they understood the danger. Sometimes awareness itself was enough. A glance across the yard, a brief nod, small acknowledgments that said more than words ever could. Neither of them planned rebellion. Neither of them imagined changing the world. They were simply trying to exist with dignity in a place that denied it. But history often moves through ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances. As autumn approached, rumors from outside the plantation grew harder to ignore. Talk of abolitionists, political arguments turning violent, a country divided against itself. The world beyond the plantation was changing faster than those inside realized. And change has a way of reaching even the places that resisted most. One night, a storm rolled across the land without warning. Wind rattled the windows of the main house while rain flooded the fields. Workers rushed to secure equipment, animals, anything that could be saved. In the chaos, boundaries disappeared for a moment. Everyone moved with the same urgency, the same fear of loss. And in that brief moment of equality, when survival mattered more than status, something became painfully clear. The system only worked when people believed in it, and belief was beginning to crack. By morning, the storm had passed. Damage remained, but the plantation still stood. What no one realized was that the real damage had already begun, not to buildings or crops, but to the idea that things would always stay the same. Because soon, a choice would have to be made, not by the owner, not by society, but by the two people whose lives had been forced together by someone else's decision. And that choice would set events in motion that no one on the plantation could stop. The calm that followed the storm felt temporary, as if the land itself knew something bigger was coming. The storm left the land quiet. For a few days, the plantation moved slower than usual. Broken fences were repaired. Flooded paths dried beneath the sun. Life appeared to return to normal, but the calm felt fragile, like something held together only by habit. People spoke less openly now, yet everyone seemed more aware. The storm had done more than damage the land. It had reminded everyone how quickly order could disappear. And once that thought entered the mind, it was difficult to ignore. He worked longer hours in the days that followed, not because he was told to, but because work kept thoughts away. Routine had always been his protection. The less he thought about the future, the easier it was to survive the present. But the future no longer felt distant. He noticed how others watched him now, some with respect, others with caution. The incident in the fields had changed something. Without intending to, he had become visible, and visibility in a place like this could be dangerous. Inside the main house, tension continued to grow. Her father grew increasingly restless. Reports from neighboring plantations spoke of unrest, of workers running away, of abolitionist ideas spreading further south. To men like him, these stories felt like threats, not only to wealth, but to identity itself. The world he understood was shifting, and he refused to accept it. So control tightened once again. New rules were announced. Movement after dark became restricted. Gatherings were discouraged. Overseers were instructed to watch more closely, to report anything unusual. Fear, once quiet, became part of daily life. She watched all of this unfold with growing unease. The more force her father used to maintain order, the clearer it became that order itself was weakening. She began to understand something unsettling. Power often appeared strongest just before it began to fail. Her own position within the house felt uncertain now. She was no longer treated as a daughter whose future needed arranging, but as someone whose actions required observation. Questions she asked were met with silence. Conversations ended when she entered the room. Isolation settled around her. And yet it was in that isolation that her perspective changed the most. She began spending more time outside the house, walking along the edges of the property where expectations felt less heavy. There, the plantation looked different, less like a symbol of success, more like a place built on exhaustion. One evening, near the end of harvest season, their paths crossed again. It wasn't planned. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields. Workers were returning to their quarters, their voices low, tired from the day's labor. He stood near the edge of the road, repairing a wagon wheel damaged during the storm. She paused nearby, unsure whether to continue walking or turn back. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them felt different now, not uncomfortable, but careful. Both understood how closely they were being watched, even when no one seemed nearby. When she finally spoke, her voice carried frustration she could no longer hide. She asked if things had changed after the storm. He answered simply, "Things always change, just not always for the better." It wasn't rebellion, it wasn't complaint, just truth. And truth, spoken plainly, carried weight. That brief exchange stayed with both of them long after they walked away, because it forced them to acknowledge something neither had fully admitted before. The future was coming, whether they were ready or not. Across the plantation, small tensions continued to build. A worker punished more harshly than usual, supplies running short after the storm, overseers growing impatient as productivity slowed. Pressure gathered from every direction. Meanwhile, beyond the plantation's borders, the nation itself moved closer to conflict. Newspapers spoke of division, of states arguing openly about slavery and freedom. Rumors traveled faster now, carried by travelers, traders, and passing wagons. The outside world was changing faster than the plantation could keep up with. And change, once close enough, becomes impossible to ignore. Her father sensed it too. His decisions became sharper, less forgiving. Where he once relied on authority, he now relied on fear. He believed firmness would prevent chaos. But fear rarely creates loyalty. It creates resentment. And resentment, left long enough, becomes action. Neither of them knew it yet, but the choices made in the coming weeks would force everyone on the plantation to confront a reality they had avoided for generations. Because the system that defined their lives was beginning to crack. And when systems crack, people must decide who they really are. The harvest season was ending. Winter would come soon, and with it, a moment that would change everything. Not through violence or rebellion, but through a decision that could no longer be undone. The first signs of that moment were already appearing, quietly. Winter arrived earlier than expected. Cold winds moved across the fields, stripping the last color from the land. Work became harder under gray skies, and the long days of harvest gave way to shorter, quieter evenings. On the surface, the plantation seemed calmer. Movement slowed, voices lowered. But beneath that calm, tension continued to grow. Winter had a way of forcing people inward, into their homes, into their thoughts. And thoughts, once given time, rarely stayed quiet. He noticed the change among the workers first. Conversations in the quarters became more serious. People spoke about the future in ways they hadn't before. Rumors from outside the plantation carried new weight now. Stories of resistance, of escapes, of places where slavery was already being challenged. Hope was dangerous. Not because it was wrong, but because it made suffering harder to accept. He tried to keep his distance from those conversations. Survival still depended on caution. Yet even he could feel something shifting. The certainty that life would always remain the same was beginning to fade. Inside the main house, the atmosphere felt colder than the weather outside. Her father spent more time reviewing accounts, speaking with neighboring landowners, discussing security and stability. The language had changed. Where men once spoke of profit and harvests, they now spoke of control. Fear had entered their world as well. She watched this transformation quietly. The man she had grown up respecting now seemed driven by something else. Not strength, but anxiety. The harder he tried to maintain order, the more fragile it appeared. And she began to understand that power often depends on belief. Once people stop believing, authority begins to weaken. Her own isolation deepened. Invitations from neighboring families stopped entirely. Her father rarely spoke to her unless necessary. The arrangement meant to restore normalcy had instead separated her from the world she once knew. Yet, in that isolation, clarity grew. She could no longer pretend ignorance. She could no longer convince herself that the system around her was simply the way things were. One evening, as frost settled across the ground, an incident broke the fragile calm. A young worker was accused of stealing food from storage. Hunger during winter was common, but punishment remained severe. The overseer made an example of him, louder and harsher than necessary, ensuring everyone witnessed it. Fear spread quickly. He stood among the others, watching in silence, fists clenched at his sides. Every instinct told him to remain still, to survive, to endure as he always had. But something inside him resisted. Not anger, something deeper. The understanding that dignity, once recognized, cannot easily be forgotten. Across the yard, she watched as well. For the first time, she saw openly what had always existed beneath the surface, a system maintained not by respect, but by fear. Their eyes met briefly across the distance. No words were spoken. None were needed. That night, the plantation felt different, quieter than usual. Even the wind seemed to carry tension through the trees. People sensed that limits were being reached, though no one knew exactly when or how things would change. In the following days, small acts of resistance appeared. Nothing dramatic, a task completed more slowly than ordered, a tool misplaced, conversations ending abruptly when overseers approached. The system still functioned, but less smoothly than before, and those in power noticed. Her father responded the only way he knew, with stricter enforcement, more supervision, less tolerance for mistakes. He believed discipline would restore order. Instead, it deepened the divide. Because fear can force obedience, but it cannot erase awareness. Between the two of them, silence remained their only protection. They spoke rarely now, understanding that attention had become dangerous. Yet the connection formed through shared understanding continued to grow. Both knew that something was coming. Not a single event, but a turning point, the moment when continuing as before would no longer be possible. Winter pressed on, cold and unforgiving. Days passed slowly, each one carrying the same uneasy feeling. The plantation still stood, the rules still existed, but belief in those rules was weakening, and once belief begins to fade, change follows. Soon a decision would be forced, not by anger, not by rebellion, but by circumstance itself. A moment where staying silent would carry consequences greater than speaking out. When that moment arrived, it would test loyalty, courage, and the meaning of freedom for everyone involved. And by then, there would be no returning to the life they once knew. The first sign came on a quiet morning when unexpected news arrived from beyond the plantation's borders.
A rider came down the main road, his horse exhausted from travel. By the time he reached the plantation house, word had already begun to spread. News always moved quickly in places where people had little else to hold on to. At first, no one knew the details, only that something important had happened beyond the borders of their quiet world. Inside the main house, voices rose behind closed doors. Newspapers were unfolded across the table, ink still fresh. The country, already divided, was moving closer to open conflict. Political arguments had turned into something more serious. States threatening separation, leaders speaking openly about war. For men like her father, the news felt personal. The plantation system was not just business, it was identity, order, and control. And now, for the first time, that foundation seemed uncertain. Outside, the workers sensed the tension immediately. Overseers moved with urgency. Instructions changed throughout the day. Supplies were counted more carefully, as if preparing for something unknown. Fear, once quiet, had become visible. He listened as fragments of conversation passed through the fields. Words like abolition, conflict, and change drifted through whispered discussions. No one fully understood what it meant, but everyone understood that the outside world was shifting faster than before. And when the outside world changed, plantations rarely remained untouched. For the first time, the future felt unpredictable. That uncertainty affected everyone differently. Some clung harder to routine, believing normalcy could protect them. Others allowed themselves to imagine possibilities they had never dared consider before. Freedom, once an impossible idea, suddenly felt closer, though still dangerous to speak aloud. Inside the house, tension between father and daughter finally surfaced. She questioned what the news meant, asked what would happen if the country truly changed. Her father dismissed the concern, insisting that order would prevail, that the way of life they knew would endure. But his confidence sounded forced, because deep down, even he understood that history was moving, and no amount of authority could stop it. Their argument ended without resolution. It always did, yet something had shifted between them. She no longer accepted his explanations as truth, and he no longer saw her silence as agreement. Outside, winter slowly began to loosen its grip. The air warmed slightly, and with it came movement. Travelers passed more frequently along distant roads. Rumors grew stronger, more detailed. Some nearby plantations had already begun preparing for instability. The idea of permanence was disappearing. One afternoon, while repairs continued near the edge of the property, another conversation unfolded between them, quieter than before, but heavier with meaning. She spoke about the news, about change coming whether people wanted it or not. He listened carefully before answering. Change doesn't come easy, not for people who benefit from things staying the same. It wasn't accusation, it was observation. And for the first time, she didn't argue, because she knew he was right. That moment marked another turning point, small, almost invisible, yet powerful. The distance between their worlds had begun to narrow, not through rebellion, but through understanding. Meanwhile, her father watched everything closely. He noticed the growing uncertainty among the workers. Productivity slowed. Discipline required more effort. The system that once functioned effortlessly now demanded constant enforcement. And enforcement came at a cost. The harder he pushed, the more resistance appeared, subtle, quiet, but undeniable. As spring approached, the land began to change again. Green returned to the fields. Work increased. Life appeared to renew itself. But renewal did not mean peace. Because alongside the new season came new pressures. Letters arrived more frequently. Neighboring landowners spoke of preparing for the worst. Some discussed moving assets. Others spoke of strengthening control before it was too late. The plantation stood at a crossroads, even if few were willing to admit it. And in the middle of it all were two people whose lives had been forced together by circumstance, now slowly realizing that their choices might soon matter more than anyone expected. The outside world was closing in, and soon, events beyond their control would force a decision that could no longer be delayed. The first real test was coming, and when it arrived, it would make one thing clear: whether loyalty belonged to the past or to the future.
Spring arrived with uneasy energy. The fields turned green again, but the sense of renewal never fully reached the people working them. Conversations were shorter now. Laughter, once rare but still present, had almost disappeared. Everyone seemed to be waiting, though no one could say exactly for what. The news from outside continued to grow more serious. Talk of conflict was no longer rumor. States argued openly. Militias formed. Newspapers carried stories of confrontation and uncertainty. The country felt like it was holding its breath. And even on the plantation, far from political centers, the effects were impossible to ignore. Her father became increasingly focused on control. Inventory was checked daily. Travel beyond the property was restricted. Overseers were reminded that discipline must not weaken, no matter what happened beyond the plantation gates.
To him, order meant survival. But order built on fear demanded constant force to maintain. The workers felt the pressure immediately. Longer hours were introduced to compensate for lost time during winter. Punishments became quicker, less forgiving. The atmosphere tightened like a rope pulled too far. He watched it all carefully. For years, he had learned how to survive by adapting, by understanding when to move forward and when to remain still. But now, even stillness felt risky. The tension surrounding the plantation made every decision feel heavier. He noticed how people looked at him again, not just with curiosity, but expectation. Without intending to, he had become someone others watched during moments of uncertainty. And that frightened him more than anything, because leadership in a place like this often came with consequences. Inside the house, the divide between father and daughter widened further. She could no longer ignore what was happening around her. The harsher rules, the growing fear, the way people avoided meeting her eyes, all of it made the reality impossible to deny. One evening, their disagreement finally erupted. She questioned whether tightening control would truly protect anyone, whether fear could really preserve a system already under pressure from the outside world. Her father's response was sharp. He spoke of tradition, of order, of responsibility. He insisted that without structure, chaos would follow, that people needed guidance, discipline, that the world functioned because lines existed. But beneath his words was something new: fear of losing power. The argument ended with silence, heavier than anger. For the first time, both understood that neither could convince the other anymore. Outside, the plantation continued its routine, but cracks were becoming visible. A worker disappeared one night. No one spoke about it openly, but everyone understood what it meant. Escape was dangerous, often deadly, yet the fact that someone tried at all sent a quiet message through the quarters. The idea of freedom was no longer unthinkable. In the days that followed, supervision increased again. Patrols at night, questions asked more frequently. Suspicion became part of daily life. And suspicion changes people. Trust faded. Conversations became guarded. Even simple interactions carried risk. Through it all, the connection between the two of them remained unspoken but present. They understood that attention had become dangerous, yet awareness bound them together in ways neither fully understood. One afternoon, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, they crossed paths near the edge of the property once more. This time, neither pretended things were normal. She spoke quietly about the fear she felt, not just for herself, but for everyone. He listened, then answered with a calm honesty that surprised even him. Fear means something's already changing. People just haven't decided what comes next. The words lingered long after they parted, because change was no longer distant, it was already happening. That night, thunder rolled across the land again, echoing like a warning. Rain fell hard against the roofs, washing dust from the fields, but leaving the tension untouched. By morning, news arrived that made everything feel closer. Conflict had officially begun in parts of the country. Fighting, division, uncertainty spreading faster than anyone expected. The world outside was no longer stable, and for the plantation, that meant the old rules could no longer guarantee safety. Her father reacted immediately, doubling down on authority, determined to hold everything together. But the harder he tried to stop change, the more obvious it became that change was unavoidable. Because history does not wait for permission. And soon, events beyond anyone's control would force a choice that could not be undone. A choice between maintaining the past or stepping into an unknown future. The plantation stood on the edge of that moment now. And when it arrived, loyalty, courage, and survival would all be tested in ways no one was prepared for. The next chapter would begin not with a decision inside the house, but with an event in the fields that would change everything. By early summer, the tension that had been building for months could no longer be hidden. The fields were alive with activity again, but the rhythm felt forced. Work continued, yet something fundamental had changed. People moved with caution, watching not only the overseers but each other. Trust had become fragile. The war outside the plantation was no longer distant news. Travelers passing along nearby roads carried stories of battles, of families divided, of entire communities uncertain about what tomorrow would bring. The idea that the old system might not survive no longer sounded impossible, and that uncertainty reached even the most powerful men. Her father tried to maintain normalcy. Orders were given as they always had been. Work schedules remained strict, discipline remained firm, but beneath his authority, cracks were forming. The more he tried to preserve control, the more difficult it became to enforce. Supplies grew inconsistent, markets became unpredictable. Communication with neighboring plantations slowed as everyone focused on protecting their own interests. The stability that once supported the plantation economy was beginning to weaken, and everyone felt it. In the quarters, conversations grew more serious. People spoke quietly about rumors of freedom, about armies moving through southern states, about laws that might soon change everything. Hope moved carefully, never spoken too loudly, but impossible to ignore. He listened without joining in. Experience had taught him that hope could be dangerous if it arrived too soon. Yet even he could feel the shift. The certainty that life would always remain the same had disappeared. For the first time, the future felt open and terrifying. Inside the house, she struggled with a different conflict. She could no longer separate herself from what was happening around her. The suffering she once observed from a distance now felt personal. Every raised voice in the yard, every punishment carried out in the name of order, weighed heavier on her conscience. She began questioning not just her father's decisions, but her own silence. Because silence, she realized, had helped maintain the very system she now questioned. One afternoon, the moment everyone feared finally arrived. A disagreement in the fields escalated faster than anyone expected. Exhaustion, heat, and months of tension collided at once. Voices rose, an overseer reacted harshly, a worker refused to continue. It lasted only minutes. But in those minutes, something irreversible happened. He stepped forward again, not in aggression, but to prevent violence. His presence stopped the confrontation from turning worse, but the act itself carried consequences. This time, it was seen as defiance. The overseer reported the incident immediately. By evening, word had reached the main house. What once might have been ignored was now viewed through the lens of fear and instability. Her father saw danger where others saw restraint. That night, discussions behind closed doors lasted longer than usual. Punishment was considered. Examples, he believed, had to be made before control slipped further away. But decisions made in fear rarely lead to peace. When she learned what was being planned, something inside her shifted permanently. For months, she had watched change approach from a distance. Now it stood directly in front of her. And for the first time, she understood that doing nothing was also a choice. Outside, the air felt heavy as another storm threatened. Workers sensed that something serious was coming. Doors closed sooner than usual. Even the animals seemed restless. He returned to his quarters that evening, aware that attention had turned fully toward him. Years of careful survival suddenly felt fragile. One moment of stepping forward had changed how others saw him and how authority responded. Yet despite the danger, regret never came, because for the first time, his actions had not been guided by fear alone. They had been guided by dignity. As night fell, lightning flashed across the horizon, illuminating the plantation in brief moments of stark clarity. The house, the fields, the quarters, all connected by a system beginning to strain under its own weight. Inside the main house, she made a decision that would alter the course of everything that followed. A decision not driven by rebellion, but by conscience. By morning, nothing would feel the same again. Because once someone chooses to act instead of remain silent, events begin to move faster than anyone expects. And the plantation, already standing on uncertain ground, was about to face the consequences of choices made long before this moment. The storm finally broke just before dawn, and with it came the beginning of the end of the life everyone thought would last forever.
The storm that broke before dawn left the plantation soaked in silence. Rainwater filled the paths between the fields, and a gray sky hung low over everything. Morning work began later than usual, but no one complained. People moved slowly, aware that something more than weather had changed overnight. The decision made inside the house had already begun to ripple outward. Her father believed firmness would restore order. The incident in the fields could not go unanswered, not now, not when uncertainty already threatened the foundation of everything he had built. To him, authority had to be visible, consequences had to be clear. But what he didn't realize was that fear, once pushed too far, stops creating obedience. It creates resolve. Word spread quietly among the workers that punishment was coming. No one spoke openly, yet the atmosphere shifted. People worked side by side in near silence, each aware that the moment ahead would affect everyone, not just one man. He felt the weight of it immediately. Years of survival had taught him how quickly situations could turn. He understood what was being prepared, even before anyone said it aloud. Yet something inside him remained calm. For the first time in his life, he knew why he had stepped forward. Not to challenge authority, not to inspire others, but because there comes a moment when a person refuses to let fear decide every action. Inside the house, she struggled with the consequences of her own choice. The night before, she had spoken against her father's decision more strongly than ever before. She argued that punishment would only deepen the tension already spreading across the plantation. Her father refused to listen. To him, hesitation meant weakness, and weakness in a time of instability felt dangerous. Their argument ended without resolution, but something irreversible had happened. She no longer saw herself as separate from what was unfolding. The suffering around her could no longer be ignored as someone else's responsibility. For the first time, she understood that morality sometimes demands risk. As the day progressed, people gathered near the yard under the pretense of work. The overseer moved with purpose, preparing to carry out orders. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation. But before anything could begin, unexpected news arrived. A messenger from a neighboring town brought word that Union forces had advanced closer than anyone expected. Fighting had moved nearer. Plantations nearby were already beginning to change their routines, uncertain of what might come next. The news spread quickly. Suddenly, the certainty her father depended on no longer existed. The outside world was moving too fast. The future he tried to hold back was already approaching. And in that moment of distraction, hesitation entered the situation for the first time. Punishment was delayed, not canceled, but postponed. For the workers, that delay meant everything. It signaled that authority itself was uncertain, that even those in power were no longer fully in control of events. He understood what it meant immediately. The world was changing faster than the plantation could adapt. That evening, as the sun finally broke through the clouds, the land looked different. Not peaceful, but suspended, as if waiting for history to catch up. She found herself standing at the edge of the property once again, watching the fields stretch into the distance. For months, she had felt trapped between two worlds. Now, both worlds seemed to be shifting at once. When they crossed paths later that evening, neither spoke about the incident directly. They didn't need to. Both understood that something larger than personal conflict was unfolding. The choices ahead would not only determine their own futures, but the future of everyone connected to the plantation. For the first time, uncertainty carried a hint of possibility. But possibility also carried danger, because when systems begin to collapse, the transition is rarely peaceful. Night fell slowly, and with it came an unfamiliar stillness. No raised voices, no arguments, only the quiet awareness that change was no longer approaching. It had arrived. Inside the house, her father sat alone longer than usual, staring at reports that no longer offered reassurance. The world he trusted was slipping beyond his control,
and for the first time, he had no clear answer. Outside, the workers waited, not for orders, but for whatever came next. And as summer deepened, the plantation stood at the edge of its final turning point, because soon, events beyond anyone's authority would force a conclusion, one that would redefine freedom, loyalty, and the meaning of power itself. The end was no longer distant, it was already beginning. The days that followed felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, but uncertain. The kind of silence that settles before something irreversible happens. Work continued across the plantation, yet everyone sensed that routine had lost its meaning. Movements were slower, conversations shorter, eyes more watchful. The news of advancing Union forces changed everything. For years, the plantation had existed as its own world, protected by distance and tradition. Now, the outside conflict was no longer a distant rumor. It was approaching, step by step, carrying with it questions no one could avoid. Her father tried to maintain control. Orders were given more frequently, schedules tightened. The overseer was instructed to keep discipline firm, to prevent unrest before it could begin. But authority built on certainty struggles when certainty disappears. The workers noticed the change immediately. Fear still existed, but it was different now, less suffocating, mixed with something unfamiliar, anticipation. No one knew what freedom would truly look like or when it might arrive, but the possibility alone altered the way people stood, spoke, and even breathed. He felt it too. For most of his life, survival meant lowering his head and enduring. Now, for the first time, the future felt unwritten. That realization brought both hope and danger. Hope because change seemed possible. Danger because uncertainty often provokes desperation in those who fear losing power. Inside the house, tension grew heavier each day. She watched her father closely, seeing exhaustion where she once saw only strength. The world he understood was slipping away, and with it, his sense of identity. Everything he believed about order and stability was being questioned by events beyond his control. Their conversations became quieter, more careful. She no longer argued openly. Instead, she asked questions about what would happen if the war reached them, about how life might look afterward. Her father avoided clear answers, not because he didn't have them, but because he feared what those answers meant. Outside, rumors spread faster than facts. Some said nearby plantations had already been abandoned. Others claimed soldiers were freeing workers wherever they passed. Stories changed with every telling, but the effect remained the same. Expectation grew stronger than fear. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the fields, a distant sound rolled across the land. Not thunder, cannon fire. Faint but unmistakable. Work stopped almost instantly. People looked toward the horizon, realizing that history was no longer approaching slowly. It was arriving. That night, sleep came uneasily to everyone. Her father stayed awake long after the lamps burned low, studying maps and letters, trying to predict what could no longer be controlled. For the first time, he understood that decisions would soon be taken out of his hands entirely. She stood by the window, listening to the distant echoes, feeling both fear and relief. The future she once imagined impossible was now unavoidable. And somewhere beyond the fields, he sat with the others, staring into the darkness, wondering what freedom would demand once it finally came. Because freedom, he knew, was not simply the absence of chains. It was the beginning of responsibility, uncertainty, and choices no one had prepared them to make. By morning, the air itself felt different. The old world was ending, not in a single moment, but in slow, undeniable steps. And everyone on the plantation understood that the next sunrise might bring change that could never be undone. And as the movement marched forward, something powerful began to change, not just in laws, not just in policies, but in consciousness itself. The struggle for Black freedom had never been only about survival. It was about dignity, about identity, about the right to exist fully in a world that had long tried to silence Black voices. And by the late 20th century, That voice was no longer asking for recognition. It was shaping culture, politics, education, and global conversations about justice. The victories of the civil rights movement opened doors, but they did not erase centuries of inequality. Economic gaps remained, mass incarceration rose, communities continued to fight against discrimination in housing, education, and employment. The battlefield had changed, but the struggle continued in new forms. Yet through every challenge, Black resilience endured. Black artists redefined music, from jazz and blues to hip-hop and R&B, turning pain into poetry and struggle into rhythm. Writers told stories that history books once ignored. Filmmakers brought hidden truths to the screen. Athletes used their platforms not just for sport, but for social change. Culture became a form of resistance, and expression became a form of power. And as the world entered the 21st century, a new generation began asking old questions again. Why does inequality still exist? Why are some voices still unheard? What does true equality really look like? Movements rose once more, reminding the world that history is not something that stays in the past. It lives in the present. It shapes institutions, opportunities, and everyday experiences. The call for justice echoed through streets, classrooms, and digital spaces, connecting generations separated by time but united by purpose. But this story, Black history, has never been only about struggle. It is also about creation, about families who built communities from nothing, about educators who taught in segregated schools with limited resources but limitless determination, about inventors, scientists, and leaders whose contributions changed America and the world, even when recognition came late or not at all. From the fields where enslaved people once labored, to universities, courtrooms, stages, and the highest offices of government, the journey reflects something deeper than progress. It reflects endurance. Because every generation carried the hopes of the one before it. The freedom songs of enslaved people became the spirituals of resistance. Those songs became the anthems of the civil rights.